are going to cover, thank you, Di and I are going to cover core strand 3. And core strand 3, you'll recall, was unpicking all of those key challenges, the potential barriers for making like a whole setting approach to inclusion. So yeah, Di, if you move on to the first slide, fab. Great, so these are the sections in core strand 3. Subsection 1 was looking at collaboration, multi-agency working, and getting you to think through why collaboration and multi-agency working is important in terms of, particularly in terms of ALN reform currently in Wales, but also getting you to think about what those challenges might be to fostering collaboration and multi-agency working. Subsection 2 then explored the benefits and challenges of cluster working, and I'm sure you've all got your own experiences of different cluster models depending on where you're based and how those are being approached in your area. Subsection 3 then looked at expertise, personal expertise, and thinking about the knowledge that we need as ALNCOs, the knowledge and expertise of approaches and strategies and matters around inclusion, and how we can support others to develop that expertise. And then the final subsection then was looking at how do we measure success, the age-old question or trap. How do we measure success of our role as ALNCOs of that function, and how do we share best practice? So right, fab, if we move on, Di. So yeah, so we've got an hour and a half. We've got a few different group activities built into this section that are going to give you a chance to get together and discuss and share and reflect on your own experiences. As Laura said, please do turn your cameras on and participate in those group discussions, because that's really like the richness of this process, isn't it? That's where all the learning comes. So we're going to, by the end of this section today, we're going to think about those challenges to multi-agency working, cluster working, looking at collaboration, team working, networking, thinking about those personal skills, attitudes and expertise that support the role of the ALNCO, and about how we measure effectiveness, how we're evaluating and how we're sharing that. Fab. So I'm not going to read through this list. These are all the things that you will have looked at through the asynchronous content for today. So there's been lots of little pockets of getting you to reflect on your own experiences and your own settings throughout that asynchronous content that's been specifically thinking about how do we work across service areas, how do we commission services, what's kind of causing barriers to that collaboration, how do we share that expertise, and all of that has been really good preparation, ready to bring you all together to get you to share those experiences and those reflections. Fab, if you move on, Di. Okay, so this should hopefully be of no surprise to anybody in the call today, that underpinning the new ALN legislation and way of working in Wales is that key element of collaboration and integration. So getting services to work together, bringing them together, giving them responsibility, shared responsibility, in order to identify the needs of children and young people, and then coordinate the support that's needed to be put into place for them, really is at the heart of the ALN Code for Wales. If you move on, Di. So our first activity, so you're going to be put into breakout rooms. In these breakout rooms, the key point I want to make is the bottom bit about identify somebody in the group to be a scribe. So we've got some Padlets for the activities so that we can capture the general feedback from all of the groups. And again, like we did in the last conference Saturday, we will share those Padlets with you so that you have all of that reflection to draw upon when you're doing your assessment. This first task is about collaborative working. And we really want you to think about the multi-agency collaborative work going on in your settings. We know that there's huge benefits to working collaboratively, working, across agencies, and collaborative working can be internal within your setting, and it can also be external with other service areas and other agencies. And we really want you to discuss together in your groups, what are the barriers to collaborative working? What are the facilitators, the enablers? So what's really supporting collaborative working to take place in your settings? And who are the different stakeholders involved in that collaborative working? So that's what we want you to really work on today in this group task. You've got 10 minutes. The QR code's here on the screen now, so if anybody wants to pull that up now, you can. It's also on the presentation which you've got up on PebblePad, and we will also stick the URL link in the chat if anybody's struggling with the QR code. Are the groups set up, Di? Perfect, brilliant. Right, well, we'll go into our groups now, and you've got it. Fab. Okay, so the next strand of this area was thinking about cluster models, cluster working, and the first thing is to note, like everything, there are pros and cons, aren't there? There are huge benefits, but there are also frustrations and challenges and barriers too. So in terms of cluster working, we know that when cluster working works well, it can really improve the way children and young people have access to services. It can really support the work of the organisations involved in those cluster working models. It can make things really efficient in terms of the use of resources, in terms of sharing practice, in terms of developing capacity across those areas. So there's huge potential benefits for it, but there are also those difficulties. And when you were reflecting on this in the asynchronous tasks for this core strand, you will have been thinking about all of these around things like how people perceive cluster working, about the kind of power issues, about how people can feel threatened at times by cluster working, that it can at times actually feel like a huge extra layer of work, add to your workload as opposed to making, your kind of work more efficient, more effective. And from the very kind of outset, one of the challenges with cluster working can be that agreeing the shared goal, like agreeing the purpose and the objective to why we're coming together as a cluster and working in this way. Fab. Di, if you, brilliant, perfect. So if you did the leadership and management in ALN module, you will be very familiar with all of the leadership models. But even if you didn't do that, in the asynchronous prep work for this core strand, you will have come across the kind of overview of distributed leadership and how distributed leadership can be seen as a leadership model that really supports cluster working, and why it's seen as a really good leadership approach for that. You can see from this quote from Harrison Spillane that this is a leadership model that is all about collaboration. It's all about empowering across an organisation or organisations and getting people to network and work, and work multi-agency. And it's about developing leadership across all parts of the system, really, and getting everybody to work together. It's not about making everybody leaders. That was one of the, if you recall the kind of summary video about distributed leadership, one of the kind of myth-buster bits was it isn't about making everybody in a system a leader, not least because not everybody wants to lead, but it's about supporting the development of leadership skills. Brilliant. Yeah, Di, if you can move on to the next slide. And again, thinking about that model, what Spillane suggested is that it's distributed leadership in terms of cluster working. It's about identifying and being aware of the leaders, the followers, and the situation, and how those different component parts interact. And, you know, the suggestion by Spillane is that we need to understand all of those different elements in the different contexts that we work in order to be able to support distributed leadership and able to support cluster working, because it is that idea that, you know, as it says at the bottom there, that the system as a whole is more than the sum of the individual parts that make up that system. Brilliant. If we move on, Di. So the second activity, the second group activity that we're asking you to think about in this section is thinking about that distributed leadership. So we want you to think about what are the key situations in which distributed leadership could support the role of the ALN core. And in those situations, who might the leaders and followers be in those different situations? So how can distributed leadership support the role of the ALN core within the setting, within your school setting, and across cluster working? So again, we've got a QR code for you there to scan, but we will also put the link, the URL link in the group rooms. Identify somebody to capture the key points of the discussion on that Padlet. These Padlets really will be a great resource for you all when you're coming to do your assessment piece. So do remember to keep jotting down your ideas as you're going through your discussions. You've got 10 minutes for this task, and then we'll call you back in and we'll get one of the groups to give some verbal feedback as well. So fantastic, Di, if you can set them off into their groups, that would be.
Okay, Jill, just before we start, I apologise in advance. I got a bit of a sore throat this morning, so I'm not quite sure what noise is going to come out, so please bear with me. So for the remainder of the course strand this morning, we're going to move on to consider some of the professional skills, attitudes and expertise which are suggested as being important for ALN cores. And then we're going to go on to consider sharing of evidence, which links into some of the comments from the last bit of feedback there. And sharing evidence of effective practice and reflect upon what we may be looking to evidence, thinking about how we evidence this, and also importantly, think about how we share this evidence with other stakeholders. So as we all know, the ALN core functions are far-reaching and the roles and responsibilities are broad. However, as we also know, ALN is the responsibility for all practitioners, regardless of titles. And if you've had the opportunity to look back at the professional standards for teachers and leadership on PebblePad, for example, I'm sure we can see how ALN links through those broad themes of pedagogy, leadership, professional learning, innovation, and collaboration. And as we said, these areas are relevant to all practitioners. However, the ALN core may very well have that additional responsibility in supporting these areas for colleagues within their setting. So we're going to move into our third breakout room shortly. Again, please can we ask that someone puts themselves forward as a scribe to capture some of the thoughts on the Padlet. The QR code's at the bottom of the screen, and we've also posted the link to this in the chat as well. So in this third breakout room then, those of you who did the leadership and management of ALN module with us last semester, this was something that you discussed in some depth really. And this was something that was commonly discussed within many of the assignments that he submitted, thinking about the skills, attitudes, expertise and experience of the ALNCO within your setting, which may or may not be you, but also the skills, attitudes and expertise that you feel that all practitioners across the setting should possess to best support inclusion. And we would like you to reflect upon how evident you think these are in your setting. So, for example, are there pockets of what you would see as being effective practice and skills within your setting, or is it more widespread? Do all staff, including teachers and non-teachers alike, and somebody mentioned school governors as another set of stakeholders in the previous feedback, for example, possess these skills and knowledge? What do you think within your setting could be improved? And also, just to finish this off, which is quite a lot to cram into just 10 minutes really, what do you think could be shared as evidence of good and preferably excellent practice within your setting in relation to skills, attitudes and expertise? So I will pause. Okay, so we're just going to recap very briefly then some of the ALNCO functions. And as we've seen before, the ALNCO role is very wide-ranging with a lot of responsibilities, including identifying needs, coordinating ALP, securing services, keeping records of decisions, for example. And one of those key aspects might be monitoring the effectiveness of provision within the setting, as well as supporting colleagues and fellow practitioners to be effective. And we are going to move on now then to think about the final substrand for core strand 3, which is how do we share effective practice? And on the PowerPoint, we mentioned the work of Jeffs, for example, and Jeffs in 2019 suggested that there are different definitions of successful practice, and these different definitions might depend upon our own personal experiences and values, or those experiences and values that are evident within our settings, and that there are different mechanisms through which to monitor and measure this practice. So there are a range of ways that we can monitor and measure the impact of practice, for example, quantitative measures, providing ongoing objective accounts of pupil progress, whilst practitioners may also use their professional judgment to consider more qualitative measures. And on the PowerPoint, we also have a diagram from Sarah 2017, who suggested that sharing of best practice may take place across different levels and with a wide range of stakeholders. And this might involve a process which involves identification of all the people and system-based knowledge assets, creation through gathering knowledge from the people and systems that hold it, storing this knowledge and then passing this between people and systems, and finally using or sharing this knowledge for benefit. They also suggested that sharing of best practice, however that is defined, is effective. However, there is also a need to recognise, as suggested by Booth 2019, a word of caution that the effectiveness of practice is often context specific and may not directly translate across different settings. For example, a particular intervention or practice may be viewed as being particularly successful within one setting. However, just transporting this intervention to a different setting does not necessarily automatically lead to the same effectiveness or outcomes. So a key role and responsibility of the ALNCO relates to monitoring, measuring and ensuring successful practice. And this leads to a number of questions, including how do we define successful practice in relation to ALN? How do we measure and monitor practice to identify what is successful? And how do we evaluate the success of the ALNCO function? And the terminology can also be quite complex as well. So the term best practice has often been used to describe what works in a particular situation or environment, whilst within this module, we are trying to consider excellence in practice. So thinking about what was mentioned on the last slide about context, the term best practice, as we said, is often used to consider particular situations or environments. And those of you who were able to join us for our first conference last month might reflect back to the Ask the Expert panel at this point. For example, Jean Ware discussed the fact that she wasn't particularly keen on the notion of measuring excellence. For example, she asked the question, what is it we're looking for? How do we measure it? If we can measure it, does it then just become a tick box target for settings to try and meet? The Jean Ware discussions around excellence, especially in relation to ALN, linked more to learner engagement and motivation, of learners having a say in shaping their learning experience and the achievements of every learner being genuinely celebrated. Whilst on a practical level, they suggested it may mean practitioners being constantly engaged in reflection upon their practice and in seeking ways to improve. Whilst Bram Norwich, who was also on the panel that day, suggested that excellence in policy very often is glossed over and suggests perhaps settings should focus on quality. Again, going back to something we mentioned earlier on, Blessing et al. 2017 suggested that practitioners may implement practices and intervention as a result of both informal and more formal sharing of evidence, including, as we said, best practice. It's vital, therefore, that there are mechanisms and infrastructure in place for settings and practitioners to be able to access and share such practice. And this then leads us on to our final group discussion activity for this session. And we're going to be considering sharing evidence-informed practice. So evidence-informed practice can be defined as the integration of research evidence alongside practitioner expertise and the people who are experiencing the practice. So it's blending knowledge from different sources in an inclusive and useful approach, because the knowledge is personal, can be context-driven, and it evolves. So thinking about some of the points we've mentioned about the complexity of the language, for example, we're now going to ask you to go into the final breakout rooms for this morning, and we're going to ask you to think about the questions that are on screen. And again, if someone in the group, please, can share these on Padlet. So we'd like you to reflect now then on what types of evidence of excellent practice or best practice are used within your settings currently. Then we'd like you to think a little bit about what mechanisms are used to share this excellent practice with others. You may also want to think about who this practice is shared with. And finally, how could this sharing of excellent practice be further developed within your setting? Again, within this last question, you might want to consider how you could further develop the sharing of excellent practice with your internal and external stakeholders, how you might be able to share your excellent practice more widely with others outside your setting. So perhaps thinking back to that discussion of cluster working earlier on, and also thinking about how excellence in practice from other settings may be best shared with you. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and I will open up the breakout rooms for you. Okay, so we just thought we'd finish off this course strand this morning by looking at this quote from Sir Michael Barber, who was the head of the government's delivery unit in the early 2000s, who developed the concept of deliverology. And deliverology, which is a word I find quite difficult to say, is looking at a methodology which is applied in particular to governmental organisations to think about whether they have met their priorities in practice. The quote that we're just going to leave you with for this bit is that policy represents just 10% of the task. The remaining 90% is about how to make that happen. And in particular, if you look at the article, if you get a chance after today, Michael Barber talks about the importance of gathering and sharing that evidence, for example, of whether the targets that have been set within policies have been met in practice on the ground. So we appreciate that this is a really busy time of year, that those reserves of personal energy and headspace are probably very nearly empty by this point in the school year. However, following today, this is something that you might want to reflect upon in terms of informing your assignment going forward. For example, thinking about those targets that your settings have in terms of meeting learning needs. Are they being met? How are they being met? How do we know they're being met? And what's the evidence? Where does that evidence gathered from? How is that evidence being shared? And finally, again, for today, we've just put up an example of a post-session activity, which is optional in terms of personal reflection. Again, if you have the time and space to consider these questions after today going forward. So thinking about some of the things that we've talked about today, and again, thinking about how this impacts upon your assignment, thinking about the roles, responsibilities and functions of the ALN EiP. How can we evaluate the effectiveness of these functions in practice? What evidence might we be using to evaluate the ALN EiP role? And how might such evidence be used within your settings to further develop and support excellent practice within your setting? So with about 30 seconds to spare before the coffee break, we're going to break now until 11:45, when we're going to be joined by Professor Jonathan Glazard as our Ask the Expert presenter for today. Again, can we ask you please that rather than leaving the Zoom link, that you stay online, but you just turn your camera off and mute your mic until we're ready to restart at 11:45. Other than that, thank you very much for your excellent engagement this morning. Some really informative points on those Padlets, which we'll share with you all following today. Diolch yn fawr.